I'm back with another seasonal favorite, a cozy autumn cardigan. This is the Seamwork Lisa pattern, a simple style with a roomy fit. I used a soft sweater fleece for the entire outer fabric, and I used a medium weight jersey for the facings. This is another quick and satisfying sewing project and a great opportunity to use some fun statement buttons. Let's get sewing. Cut a few pieces of interfacing measuring 1.5 by 1.5 inches for each of the buttonhole areas for both front bodice pieces. Place your pieces of interfacing onto the wrong side of your front bodice pieces directly over your buttonhole markings transferred from the pattern piece. Fuse in place. And be sure to do this for both front bodice pieces. Place your back bodice piece right sides together with your front bodice pieces and align the shoulder seams. I'm going to cut 2 pieces of clear elastic to fit each of the shoulder seams. Now I'll pin the shoulders, catching the elastic. Now I'll serge both of these seams through all layers. The seam allowance is 3/8 of an inch. Place your facing pieces right sides together and align the shoulder seams. Pin in place, then we'll sew these seams at 3/8 of an inch and press the seam allowances toward the front. We're also going to finish the outer edges from the bottom of one front piece all the way around to the bottom of the opposite front piece. Here are the right sides of both of my front bodice pieces, and I'm going to attach the neckline facing. Placing this facing right sides together with the bodice, aligning the shoulder seams and the notches, and pinning in place. And just make sure that the seam allowances of the facing and the seam allowances of the main shoulder seams are pressed in opposite directions. This way there will be less bulk as you sew. Then I'm going to serge starting at the bottom of one front piece all the way around the neckline until I'm back at the bottom of the opposite front piece. Now that we've attached the facing all the way around, I've gone ahead and pressed the facing and its seam allowance away from the garment. And we're going to top stitch. We're going to sew the seam allowance to the facing, stitching about 1/8 of an inch away from the original seam, catching the seam allowance all the way around as we go. As you're sewing around that pointed area at the center front of the front bodice pieces, understitch as far as you can, breaking your stitches around the point. Back stitching to secure. Here is the bottommost edge of one of my front bodice pieces, and I'm going to secure the facing to the bottom of the bodice. Fold the facing on top of the bodice right sides together along the main seam and pin along the bottom of the facing. Do this for both front bodice pieces. Sew the facings in place here with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Now that those bottom edges are sewn, we can turn the facing to the inside of the garment and give those center front edges and the neckline a good press. Here are the right sides of my front and back pieces opened out away from each other at the shoulder seam. Place each of your sleeves right sides together with the bodice pieces, making sure you're attaching the correct sleeve to the correct side of the bodice. Pin in place, matching your notches. And repeat on both sides. Now I'll serge both of my sleeves to the bodice with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Now with the front and back bodice pieces and their sleeves right sides together, pin the side seams and the underarm seams. Repeat for both sides of the garment. Then we can sew from the bottom of the side seam to the bottom of the sleeve in one continuous stitch with a 3/8 inch seam allowance, repeating on both sides. Fold both of your cuff pieces right sides together along the longer edge. Sew these edges with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. And then fold the cuff pieces wrong sides together. To prepare the bottom of the sleeve for attaching the cuff, we're going to sew basting stitches all the way around. Leave tails of thread on either side of the seam so that you have threads to pull for gathering. Do this for the bottoms of both sleeves. Now I'll pull the basting stitches so that the bottom of the sleeve fits the top of the cuff. Once it fits, I'll place these right sides together and pin the raw edges together, making sure to align the seams. Now I'll serge this in place with a 3/8 inch seam allowance and repeat to attach the other cuff. Now we're going to top stitch the center front and the neckline of the bodice all the way around. Do this top stitching with a 2-inch seam allowance using your cover stitch machine, a twin needle, or a narrow zigzag stitch. Stitch from the bottom edge of the front bodice piece all the way around to the opposite bottom edge. Along the entire bottom edge of the cardigan, I've gone ahead and pressed my bottom raw edge to the wrong side by 5/8 of an inch. Now using a cover stitch machine, a twin needle, or your narrow zigzag stitch, stitch close to that top inner edge from one side of the center front all the way across to the opposite side. I've transferred the buttonhole markings from the pattern piece onto my right front bodice piece. Now I'll sew my buttonholes in place. Mark your button placement on the opposite front bodice piece and then sew them in place. And now your cardigan is complete. Thank you for watching this sew along. Make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future sewing tutorials, and I'll see you in the next video.